Undertale is such a special gem. Created in 2015 by the genius Toby Fox, it is a true testament to the fact that quality gaming does not mean a huge budget or a massive AAA title development team. When discussing the qualities that made Undertale so great, most people quite rightly bring up the same things. Its extremely memorable and likable cast of characters, its razor-sharp wit and dissection of video game tropes, its glorious music which frequently gets played by orchestras, its moral gameplay choices which actually affect the story, and its fourth wall breaks. As much as I love all of these things, today I'm here to talk about something a little less mentioned, and if you've read the title, you know that it's the amazing use of turn-based combat. The tutorial to Undertale is a joke, but it's a pretty clever one. If you've never played the game before, now is the time to go and play it real quick before I spoil what is one of my favourite moments in all of gaming. It'll only take 6 hours or so. I'll be waiting when you get back. Okay, so now you're back, you know the bit I mean. You fall down the hole and meet a nice little flower friend. He tells you he's going to share his love with you using little white friendliness pellets, and tells you to catch as many as you can. But you soon realise in this world, it's kill or be killed, and you've also learned that this turn-based RPG is actually partly a bullet hell. Firstly, let's consider a normal turn-based RPG. When it's not your turn, what are your options? I'm sure there are a few exceptions to this rule, but in my experience, the answer is pretty much nothing. You can have certain passive abilities that can activate during your opponent's turn, and you can decide to block beforehand. But other than that, there's usually just a dice roll on whether your opponent's attack hits or misses. When it is your turn, the process is more involved, but still lacking. You can exploit elemental weaknesses of enemies for extra damage, or chain attacks together and do an extra special move. There's also buffs, debuffs, and blocking, and this lends to a much more strategic experience, but the moment-to-moment gameplay is still just selecting the best option from a menu and watching it play out. Special credit here to Final Fantasy VIII, which had a trigger system to avoid this exact issue. I find it especially frustrating when an attack hits or misses or does critical damage just based on a random roll. I understand all this randomness comes from tabletop board games which inspired the genre, but it's such a waste of potential. The issue I have, and which Undertale remedies perfectly, is that, barring Final Fantasy VIII, none of these options really involve your input as a player at all. Strategic, yes, but fun, not really. Plus, you're just expected to tank the damage from enemies, so even if you're a perfect strategist, there isn't really any way to use your skills to win without taking damage at all, meaning that certain encounters can seem overly difficult or even impossible just because you haven't grinded your level high enough. Undertale's solution to this is to turn the whole thing into basically a selection of mini-games. Instead of just standing there and taking the damage, you can move out of the way. Who would have thought? Instead of just attacking, your attacks need to be timed for maximum damage like in Final Fantasy VIII, with different weapons having different timings. The exact same thing was employed with the perfect reload in Gears of War, and I think the extra level of interactivity makes the gameplay so much more dynamic. The crazy part is that even though Undertale's attack animation is basically non-existent, getting a perfect crit in the minigame makes you feel much more badass on your own merit compared to a traditional turn-based RPG, where the gameplay is just choosing a menu option, but your character does a super flashy attack. Undertale also has options for non-offensive offensive moves, a much harder tactic for those who don't fancy murdering everyone they come across. You must judge the personalities of each enemy and decide on the correct act based on that. It's usually not very involved from a gameplay perspective, and once you know the technique for each enemy, the rest are the same, but it adds an extra layer to the gameplay. The rewards for these pacifist options aren't in extra damage or HP, they're in humour and story, which actually led me to choose these options most of the time on my first playthrough. When it's not your turn, each enemy's attack has a different pattern and is relevant to their theme. Napster Bloop, the depressed ghost, attacks by crying on you and has a harmless text attack. To beat Old Bloopy, you have to cheer them up until their self-esteem is high enough for them to decide to go home. Aaron, the muscular seaman, attacks by sending his flexing muscles up towards you while sweat drops from his body downwards. To beat him, you have to challenge him to a flex-off until he flexes so hard that he flexes himself out of the room and you win by default. Or just kill him, of course. It doesn't end here though, and the game slowly introduces mechanics that increase the complexity of the situation. Enemy attacks have varying different colours, which change how they affect the player. There are grey attacks like the one mentioned from Napster Bloop, which do no damage at all. There are red attacks that warn you of upcoming attacks, green attacks which can heal the player, blue attacks which do no damage if the player is standing still, and orange attacks that do no damage if you are moving. But we aren't done yet. Even with all this added complexity, it is the boss fights that truly change how this game can be. By changing the colour of your heart, each boss can change the gameplay dramatically. In your second boss fight against Papyrus, he turns your heart blue, and you are suddenly subjected to gravity. Even though you're still within the confines of the same minigame, the style has been flipped on its head, and you quickly realise the fight has become a mix of what it was before and a 2D platformer. When fighting Fishhead, she turns your heart green, which locks you in place, and gives you a shield which you must use to block her incoming attacks from 4 separate directions, almost like DDR. For Muffet, the Spider Queen, she turns you purple, and you have to move along her intricate webbing, dodging her baby spiders. And when fighting Metaton, your heart turns yellow and flips into a kind of old school bullet hell shooter, and you shoot projectiles at various incoming hazards. This short rundown of the insane breadth of changes introduced by these boss fights should stand as testament that Toby put so much effort into the design of his combat. Not only does each change still fit the theme of the boss, but it changes the gameplay of the fight significantly. Where most games would give you the bullet hell addition to turn-based combat and be done with it, Undertale is constantly innovating on its own ideas and staying fresh while keeping you on your toes. Oh yeah, and the Switch version has another exclusive fight where you control the heart with each thumbstick. Just before we end, let's look at an Undertale fight in full swing. Now let's look at a normal turn-based RPG. Awesome? Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that old school turn-based combat is pretty stale by today's standards, and rather than feeling like you're an omnipotent tactician just picking options, Undertale has shown us that adding extra steps can actually make you feel involved in the combat and produce a greater sense of reward while you're there. Even something simple like a minigame testing your timing makes the game feel more engaging than even the most impressive animations. And also, Toby Fox is a fucking genius. Thank you, Toby, for showing the world turn-based combat can be good. Thank you to Sans for all the laughs, and thank you for watching. Cheers.